Hello, as part of designing the No Script Show's website, I have talked before about light and dark themes and briefly on the topic of adding a toggle switch. Here I'm going to more closely look at the implementation of a toggle and share some alternative code. I skimmed over this topic before because it was getting away from what our show is about. Our show is really about how easy it has become to make effective websites with only modern CSS and HTML. And everything I was doing with this toggle led further away from this. And it made me more strongly agree with Bramus van Damme, a developer relations engineer at Google, that these per site toggle switches should be a browser feature. This is something that was rumored to be coming a couple of years ago to Safari around the same time that Bramus was raising this issue. And ideally for me, I would like to see Bramus and Luke Warlow's proof of concept Chrome extension, which is just recently out, getting more attention just to show browser vendors that the demand is there. And I think if we look at how complex it's become for non-programmers to implement a dark or light switch properly, and that's what I'm trying to do in this case, I think it actually makes their case. Modern CSS does make it relatively easy for us to create different themes with color scheme, and for those to be honored by a user's system preference with the media query of prefers color scheme. But in giving us this and encouraging us to make themes, I think it also creates the demand, or at least the desire, to offer this option to our visitors on our own individual sites with a toggle. And in doing this, it creates a dependency back on custom JavaScript. We either have to duplicate our light and dark code, one for the JavaScript and one for the prefers color scheme, or in the case of JavaScript failure, have to ignore a user's system preferences altogether. And we also have to compromise when we are working with light and dark images and icons or any other feature that we might set to a particular theme. I'm going to talk about this next time. I needed a mini site in order to do that. What I'm going to concentrate on here is the additional accessibility considerations. Now, the code I'm going to use this time comes from Salma Alam-Naylor. She's got this really excellent article over here which explains all of her code, and that's what we're using. Now, we have made some additions to the code that's here, so you'll find this in the article that goes with this video. So if you're watching on YouTube, the link should be below, but I'll explain those as I go through. And I could have equally have used this one on web.dev, the dark and light theme switch. It's by Adam Argyle, and it has this really beautiful SVG animation, all the code that we need. And I think there's a video as well talking about the animation on this. It is used on Adam's site too, but actually on his site, there are some things that aren't included in his instructions. So I've been looking at that. I've also looked at Una Kravitz, who's a colleague of both Adam and Bramus, and she has, again, some beautiful animation on hers and some other features with changing over, which I quite liked. And one other person that I look to for inspiration, that is Michelle Barker. This is one of her sites, CSS in Real Life, where she has this toggle switch. And all of these have some things in common with what I was sharing before. They're all using a HTML button for the switch. They are all trying to honor a user's system preference first, and they all use a browser's local storage to hold any of those changes in preference. Now, I'm not sure why they chose a button over a checkbox input, which has been used on some other solutions. I did doubt the semantics of my own button choice, and it's probably irrelevant, but even here, when we only have this two options switch, it's interesting that there is a division in how developers might go about that. I think Michelle Barker's CSS in Real Life is closest to what I was showing before, in the sense that I think it has a default light theme to which JavaScript adds a class selector for the dark theme styles. Let me just show you it here rather than refresh on what I was doing before. Oops, I can't do that. I need to turn this on or we won't see them. Let me just go and inspect now. And I think just switching that on should have, if I go down here, yep, there we are. There's all that color scheme for this class selector which has come in. So I'm assuming it's the same as on mine where this was below in the cascade. So this takes over when this selector is activated on here. She does go one more step on this, and I'll cover this more as I go on, in the sense that she does accommodate and duplicates her code for those people and their system preferences should JavaScript fail, which of course is the ideal. And I can kind of show you on this because there's a slight difference in the dark theme. So if I disable the JavaScript here and refresh, and I'll need to use this nice toggle thing. I don't know if you noticed, but the styling is slightly different. There wasn't this bar on the other dark version on this. So it just shows that she is using two sets of code on that. Let me just bring that back. Okay, let me concentrate. Oh, well, just quickly mention as well that if you are trying to test these things, it's quite, I mean, it's obviously a lot easier being able to change the settings and preferences over here. But also, when you're thinking about all the different scenarios, perhaps someone's been to your site before, but the JavaScript fails this time, and you want to check whether things are working the way they should do. You do spend an awful lot of time, and this is Chrome here, so I'm going into applications, clearing out the local storage, which I can just do by right-clicking and clearing here. It's pretty similar on Firefox. I think it's called storage there, and you go directly to it. So it's pretty time-consuming just making sure everything is working here. Okay, let's talk about what's different with the other sites to Michelle's and what I offered before. And I can show that on Salma's code here. They're all using a data attribute instead. So they have data theme light and data theme dark on this. I don't think it really matters, but in some ways I'm going to swap to this because it's possible that browsers might soon support a media query for no preference. So the idea of having these three different styles and grouping them that way might kind of make sense going forward. So that's what I'm doing. Let me quickly cover what is happening here. I'm sure it's in the instructions, but when we come to the button that we've got here, this is dynamic. So what we are seeing there is in the HTML, should the JavaScript be failing, but it's actually changed over here. So with the ARIA label for screen readers, when we swap over to the other theme, then it will change that one to swap to dark theme as appropriate. And the same with the text that is being used over there. So it's pretty cool on that. But what we want to do is to add in an icon. So if I go over to Salma's site herself, she's done this. And obviously she's got this pretty cool way of reading out to screen readers. All she really needed to do with that is to just include that as a background image. So it's purely decorative and in the CSS. In my case, and maybe I'm overcomplicating it, I've decided, and I won't say this very often, I went with ChatGPT's suggestion to add the icons to the buttons HTML via JavaScript. So that's what I've done. Let me just show you that. And if we go into here, we take a look. And there's some extra code on the button here, which I'll try and explain as we go on. So here we can see the ARIA label. This is coming from Salma's code, and you can see it's pretty cool. It swaps over as we swap this. And I've done the same with the images. So the images have gone in here. You'll need to change it if you're using my code to reference the correct place where your images are. And what this does do is it allows me to add in an alt text. So if a screen reader is to hover over it, it's going to read the alt text that says that this is a moon icon that changes this site from a light to a dark theme. Or at least it would do if I hadn't put this ARIA hidden true on there. And I've just put this in here. Obviously, I'll be removing it. It's just to say if you are using my code and you don't want it to read out like this, you could just do that if you want and add that in. So that's pretty much how that is working there. I won't get into the topic of the UI with toggles. There's a lot talked about the accessibility of toggles. There is this one, Toggles Suck, which explains, and I can relate to that with a lot of these side-by-side toggles. I think most of the ones that I see for dark and light are self-explanatory. It's interesting that Nathan, the co-host on the show, his impression was that this kind of side-by-side toggling, although, you know, a little bit prettier than this, are what is the norm these days. That's his kind of experience with it. And I think he might be right on this one because there's a lot of CodePen examples of this done with CSS. But it's interesting with all of the 4 sites that I featured, it's got the single switch from one icon to the other. And I think that is what we'll be going with. I think we decided that We wanted to go with the most space saving and the least attention grabbing, because we think there are better things that a visitor needs to focus on when they go to our site. Okay, let me move on to the situation when there's no JavaScript. So with Salma's code over here, this is set up the example that you're not going to want to duplicate your code. So you will need some kind of fallback if the JavaScript's not working. And that's what this HTML is doing here. So we set this to light, and obviously it'll change how we set up our buttons here as our defaults if the JavaScript fails. And this is probably what we will do, and I'll explain the reason for this, but this isn't what the others have done. They've duplicated their code and they've honored the preferences if the JavaScript fails. So I've done this just as a mock-up on my code. So let me just go and bring up the editor for that. And obviously in the CSS, I've needed to put two sets of code in here. So at the top here, I've put the prefers color scheme to light and the dark over here and put the colors in here. Now, the ones that are the default styling that I've been doing up to this point was this data theme attribute. And I've put more in here because I've got other details with the images in here, and I've purposely left them off the top on this one. But this isn't enough to, I mean, these need to be above this, I think, to work properly. But in addition to Salma's code, what I've needed to do, and I think it's true of the others, is I've needed to add some extra JavaScript, which takes care of the situation of, let's say they've been to your site before and they've got a preference already set, you know, which situation you're going to have when the JavaScript fails. And I think this is what this script, but it is ChatGPT, so use it. It seems to work, but you need to test this one for yourself. But this shows the extra complication you get into. This, obviously, I've stuck it in the head over here because it needs to activate before the other JavaScript, really, and that's just there. But we're not going to do this, and the reason we're not going to do this is, if I just bring up our site again, and go into, I think I'll go on this page where I've done some extra work. So what we'll see here is that I put some extra icons in the dark mode over this on this list items, which is a different one when we come to the light theme. And because I haven't put all of that code in there, if I go to disable JavaScript, then it is, oops, on this one it's really failing. Because I've set up two images to make it work on there. Let's go back to that one. And we can see we've lost some of our styling. And I think when you really get into proper theming with this, where you really do give a different experience for the dark and light, you end up working on a lot of other properties in there. And then you've got to remember to duplicate this in two places. I'm sure the maintenance of that gets difficult. And also you start to build up the amount of code which you have. So is it worth it relative to the few number of people whose JavaScript might fail, who don't happen to have gone with the preference that you've already set for them, which maybe the majority of people don't set any preference at all. So that's the kind of balancing act, but none of this is the ideal, I don't think. One other thing just to mention on JavaScript, which isn't included, I think, in either of the tutorials that I've mentioned, and that is if we've got a toggle switch and no JavaScript, there's no point in showing the toggle switch. So I've removed that. So I'll just bring it back just to show you how that was done, and it's in the code that I'm providing. So let's make it come back. Okay, and we'll go into inspecting this again so you can see what the addition is here. So we've needed actually I needed to create an ID as well for that in the JavaScript here. But in the HTML itself, it's got this inline style of display none. So when the JavaScript is not working, this disappears. And only when the JavaScript works, it comes in and replaces that with display block, allowing it to show on the top. And if we looked at the accessibility tree, it is showing the button over here now, but with the display none, it should disappear. So screen readers also will have that disappear as if it didn't exist. Okay, there are a couple of other things that I could have easily tripped over with this, and one of those is, and it's thanks to Nathan showing me somebody else's, and I just happened to go to their site, and I used the tab to get to it, and it didn't allow me. It bypassed it altogether, and I realized, whoops, I could do exactly the same thing. So we need people to be able to tab, we need to show an outline around it. But if you saw one of my earlier videos, I kind of set myself up to fail on this, because if I scroll down here, I was talking about the benefits of this fairly new property, focus visible, which uses the browser's own heuristics to kind of work out when someone needs an outline around the different elements. So it depends on how you're interacting with the browser. And in this particular case, it's a button where it would remove the outline by default, because most buttons are pretty much styled. We don't want that outline. We don't need it around it if we are sighted. But in this case, we're not using the button in the normal way. So what I've needed to do is to exclude it by just putting this not the toggle on this. And one other thing as well that I think is important, there's not really any animation on here, but I noticed on the web dev Adam's tutorial that his beautiful SVG animation was all wrapped in a media query of prefers reduced motion set to no preference, meaning that anybody who'd set it to no animation or reduced animation didn't get the animation in this case. So I think that's an important thing. And finally, just one other thing I wanted to talk about. Again, it's not in any of the instructions. It's just something I noticed in both Adam's own site and Una's. So let's just have a look at Una's. If I just go over here, it is the use of ARIA Live. So I'll just find it over here. There it is. It's ARIA Live set to polite, and it's just presently on my code. You might have spotted it. And what this does, I wasn't that aware of it, but it gives screen readers an update of regional changes which you'll set, which they might not otherwise be aware of because the reader is focused elsewhere. So the best example I can give for this is a checkout form where there might be an input to add something to your order that will alter the price that is positioned elsewhere in the region. And that changed price will be announced politely when the input is checked. So it's replicating what I guess most sighted users would do. If they know they're about to tick on something that's going to change a price, they'll be doing something with their hands in one place and their eyes will be looking elsewhere. But after trying this out on the only screen reader available to me, which is NVDA, this is open source and I think the most popular still used, it didn't really work out the way that I wanted it. If I just go back to my site again, and if I just go and inspect this, what it did is that, actually I think I need to move to that page. And yeah, so what it did is it read out that there was a switch to dark theme if they were coming on light theme button. It said that, and then if I was to toggle on this, then it would say switch to light theme and announce that. And I imagine they would understand their action saying what the next thing they could do if they wanted to swap back, and that would be enough. By adding the ARIA Live polite on this, what happened with this screen reader in my circumstance, and it might be a bug with that, is it read out the same, saying the button. When I swapped it, it read out switch to light theme 3 times, and then it read out the old text that I had here, and I thought that was a pretty terrible experience. And it wasn't really good on Una's or Adam's as well, so I'm thinking it might be a bug, but I'll be just interested if anybody knows whether it's useful in this circumstance. I can certainly see it on a complex checkout and how that might be quite good there. Anyway, that brings me to the end. I hope it was useful to someone. Please let me know if I've got anything entirely wrong. It's very likely, as working with a toggle is pushing me well beyond my skill set and towards feeling a little bit less certain. And I think that alone backs up Bramus's arguments to let browsers do this. I think as dark and light themes become increasingly expected or standard, I'd rather be focusing on better designs using just the one set of CSS that everybody else is using, rather than going it alone with my own custom JS hacks or just taking something off the shelf which I can't trust. And I feel even more sure of this because I looked at a couple of switches that were made for the massive WordPress audience, and they've not taken anything like the care that the people I featured here have on it. Even the HTML's not semantic on it. So previously I would have jumped excitedly on these thinking I'm increasing my accessibility, where I'm also introducing some problems. And whilst I don't think that's as bad as the way that the accessibility overlays market has gone, which I'm sure was well intended in the first place, I do think some early standards might avoid a similar thing happening. Anyway, that's kind of my rant. So that's over. Thank you so much for listening. Feel free to fight me. I'm pretty open-minded on this. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.